What is happening inside the Steelers building right now goes far beyond a few routine offseason moves. And if you are paying close attention, you can feel that this is one of those moments where a franchise quietly shifts direction without making a huge public announcement. Mike McCarthy has continued to reshape his coaching staff, and every single decision he has made over the last few days carries weight, both for the present and for what the Steelers are clearly trying to line up for the future. This is not random, and it is not business as usual in Pittsburgh. Everything starts with the offensive coordinator search. Scott Tolzien, currently the Saints quarterbacks coach, was in Pittsburgh to interview for the open offensive coordinator position, and the league-wide expectation is that this is heading toward a conclusion sooner rather than later. Around the Steelers beat, there's a growing sense that this is very similar to how the Patrick Graham situation unfolded, where all signs pointed in one direction well before anything became official. When respected voices close to the team are confident enough to say this is happening, it tells you that the internal process is already deep into its final stages. If Tolzien does become the offensive coordinator, it will be a clear signal of the type of structure McCarthy wants offensively, especially in how the quarterback position is coached and managed day to day. At the same time, the Steelers have taken a hit on the defensive side of the ball with the loss of defensive backs coach Gerald Alexander, who is heading to Minnesota to join Brian Flores' staff as pass game coordinator. This is a promotion, and it matters. Alexander did strong work with the Steelers' secondary last season, helping players like Joey Porter Jr. and James Pierre continue to develop into legitimate contributors. Brandon Echols also had a solid year under his guidance, and even difficult transitions, like moving Yolan Ramsey from nickel corner to safety, were handled with stability. Kyle Duggar, who struggled previously, was able to find a more effective role in Pittsburgh as well. Losing Alexander is not just losing a position coach, it is losing a developmental voice that was clearly making an impact in 2025. The Steelers have already moved to fill that void by elevating Jason Simmons into the defensive backs coach role. Simmons had interviewed for the defensive coordinator position earlier in the process, which tells you how highly he is regarded internally. There is still a possibility that his responsibilities grow even more, but for now, he steps into a critical role at a time when continuity in the secondary matters. Another move that has drawn a lot of attention is the hiring of Danny Crossman as special teams coordinator. Crossman comes over after a rough stint in Miami, where special teams performance was a consistent issue, eventually leading to his dismissal. This hire stands in stark contrast to what the Steelers are losing with Danny Smith. Departing for Tampa Bay, Smith was widely viewed as one of the best special teams coordinators in football, and replacing that level of consistency is never easy. This decision has naturally raised concerns, especially considering McCarthy's past teams have not always been strong in this phase unless supported by elite coordinators. Crossman now walks into Pittsburgh with immediate pressure to stabilize a unit that has been a strength for years. Beyond those headline moves, the Steelers have continued to quietly interview and add coaching talent. CJ Ayu, the outside linebackers coach from Texas Tech, has been interviewed and is highly respected for his work developing edge defenders. Chase Hazlitt, the tight ends coach in New Orleans, has also interviewed for a role that could include pass game coordination duties. At just 33 years old, he represents the kind of young, upwardly mobile coach teams like to bring into the building early. Then there is the hiring of Frank Cignetti Jr., who returns to Pittsburgh in an offensive role after serving as offensive coordinator at IUP. Cignetti previously worked under Mike McCarthy in Green Bay and has deep ties to the city, having coached at Pitt in the past. On the surface, this looks like another familiar comfort-based hire, but this move carries a much larger implication that cannot be ignored. Cignetti's history with Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay was reportedly strained, to the point where communication between the two became a real issue. That context matters because McCarthy has openly indicated that bringing Aaron Rodgers back is part of the plan. This is where things get complicated and where Steelers fans should really be paying attention. If Rodgers is truly part of the vision, every coaching hire around him matters. While Cignetti would not be working with Rodgers directly on a daily basis, the optics of bringing in someone with that history naturally raise questions. At the same time, it is important to understand that Rodgers' primary relationships would be with McCarthy himself, the offensive coordinator, and the quarterbacks coach. As long as those lines are strong, this hire alone is unlikely to be the deciding factor in whether Rodgers returns. All of these moves together paint a picture of a team that is trying to balance familiarity with change, stability with risk, and long-term vision with immediate pressure to win. Nothing here feels accidental, and nothing feels disconnected. The Steelers are clearly building towards something, but there are real consequences attached to each decision, especially when it comes to the quarterback position and the offensive identity of this team moving forward. Based on everything happening right now inside the organization, do you believe these coaching moves bring the Steelers closer to their plan, or do they create more uncertainty than clarity? When you follow this trail a little further, the ripple effects start to reach the locker room, and And that is where this story really gains tension. Because coaching hires are not just about whiteboards and meeting rooms. They directly affect how players see their own futures in Pittsburgh. One name that keeps surfacing in league conversations right now is Roman Wilson. And whether people want to admit it or not, his situation is tightly connected to everything we have been talking about so far. There is a growing belief around the team that Roman Wilson may not be thrilled about the possibility of Aaron Rodgers returning. This is not something that came directly from Wilson himself, but when respected insiders start connecting dots, it becomes part of the discussion whether fans like it or not. The logic behind it is simple. Wilson is a young wide receiver who has already spent 2 seasons fighting for opportunities, and last year did not unfold the way he likely envisioned. As the season progressed, his role shrank, and the team brought in veterans like Adam Thielen and Marquez Valdes-Scantling, which pushed him further down the depth chart. By the end of the year, he was largely on the sidelines. If Rodgers does return, Wilson could reasonably fear that nothing changes for him, or worse, that he remains stuck in a limited role because Rodgers has always leaned heavily on receivers he trusts implicitly. That trust factor has shaped entire depth charts throughout Rodgers' career. We have seen talented young receivers struggle to earn snaps simply because the quarterback was more comfortable throwing to veterans who understood his timing, his adjustments, and his body language. From that perspective, it would not be shocking if Wilson felt that a fresh start elsewhere might give him a better chance to prove himself. At the same time, there is another side to this that deserves attention. With Mike McCarthy now shaping the offense, the structure itself could open doors that were not there before. McCarthy's system traditionally makes heavy use of deep crossing routes and layered concepts that allow receivers with speed and route discipline to find space across the middle of the field. When you look at Wilson's skill set through that lens, it is not hard to imagine him carving out a role similar to what Brandon Cooks has been in McCarthy-led offenses. Not a featured star, not someone you build the entire passing game around, but a reliable piece who can punish defenses when they focus too heavily on the top options. That is why it feels premature to write Wilson off entirely. The smarter approach for the Steelers may be to stop forcing him into a role he is not suited for and instead let him compete as a wide receiver 3 or 4 without the pressure of being the guy. If he develops, great. If not, the team still maintains flexibility because he remains under rookie contract control and the wide receiver room is far from settled. And that brings us to the other major layer of this story, the outside help the Steelers are clearly exploring at wide receiver. One name that keeps coming up is Romeo Dew, and this is not happening by accident. From a pure football standpoint, Dew checks boxes the Steelers desperately need checked. He wins against man coverage, he runs crisp routes, and he understands how to work within a timing-based passing offense. From a bigger picture standpoint, the connection to Aaron Rodgers makes this even more intriguing. Dew already has established chemistry with Rodgers from their time together in Green Bay, and that matters more than raw talent in certain offenses. Rodgers' game has always been built on trust throws, back shoulder timing, and subtle adjustments at the line of scrimmage. Dew fits naturally into that world. He is also still young enough to be a long-term piece, not just a short-term patch. If the Steelers can land him on a reasonable contract, it would immediately stabilize the receiver room and remove some of the pressure heading into the draft. The key detail here is that adding someone like Dew would not block the Steelers from continuing to invest at the position. It would actually give them freedom. They would no longer be desperate. They could let the board come to them, whether that means drafting a receiver if the value is right or focusing resources elsewhere. And if Rodgers does return, having at least one receiver he already trusts could be the difference between a functional offense and one that constantly feels out of sync. When you step back and look at all of this together, the picture becomes clearer. The coaching hires, the quarterback plan, the receiver rumors, and even the uncertainty around younger players like Roman Wilson are all interconnected. This is a front office and coaching staff trying to align short-term competitiveness with long-term stability, and that is not an easy needle to thread. Some of these moves feel safe, some feel risky, and some feel like bets that will only make sense months from now. The Steelers are not done yet, not even close. But the foundation they are laying right now will shape how the rest of this offseason unfolds and how this team looks when it finally takes the field. If you have followed me this far, you can see why this moment matters so much. Now, I want to hear from you. There is one more layer to this that cannot be ignored, because all of these conversations eventually come back to the same core question. What version of the Steelers are we about to see on the field? When you listen closely to how this staff is being assembled, it feels like Pittsburgh is leaning into experience and familiarity, even if that comes with some uncomfortable history attached. Mike McCarthy is surrounding himself with people he knows, people who understand his language, his structure, and how he wants a team run. That can create efficiency quickly, but it also narrows the margin for error if the vision itself is flawed. This is why the Aaron Rodgers angle refuses to go away. The entire offensive plan makes far more sense if Rodgers is under center. The potential hire of Scott Tolzien, the emphasis on timing and structure, the rumored interest in receivers like Romeo Dew, all of it aligns cleanly when you insert Rodgers into the equation. Without him, the picture becomes much murkier, and suddenly some of these decisions feel less cohesive. That is the gamble. The Steelers are building as if they expect clarity soon, but until that clarity arrives, every move is judged through a lens of uncertainty. At the same time, the organization is clearly trying to protect itself from being boxed into a corner. Keeping Roman Wilson, even amid trade speculation, preserves flexibility. Interviewing younger coaches alongside veteran hires balances the staff. Even controversial decisions, like bringing in Danny Crossman, suggest the Steelers believe their culture and structure can elevate individuals who struggled elsewhere. That belief has defined this franchise for decades. For better or worse, what makes this moment so fascinating is that none of these choices exist in isolation. If Rodgers returns and the offense clicks, these hires will be framed as calculated and smart. If it falls apart, they will be viewed as stubborn and overly nostalgic. The margin between those two outcomes is razor thin, and it will be defined not by headlines, but by how these pieces actually function together once the season begins. This is why the coming weeks matter so much. Official announcements, player decisions, and final staff alignments will either confirm the direction or expose cracks in the plan. The Steelers are not hiding what they are trying to do, but they are also not spelling it out. They are daring this roster, this staff, and this fan base to trust the process one more time. If we keep pulling on this thread, the final thing that stands out is how deliberately quiet the Steelers are being while all of this unfolds. There are no grand statements, no aggressive leaks trying to sell fans on a vision. Instead, everything is being communicated through actions: who they interview, who they hire, who they let walk, and sometimes who they are willing to upset in the process. That silence is intentional, and it puts even more pressure on the results. Look at the balance of this roster right now. On defense, despite losing Gerald Alexander, the Steelers are still betting on internal continuity, promoting Jason Simmons signals trust in what was already built, not a desire to reinvent the wheel. On offense, however, the tone is completely different. There is a sense of reconstruction, almost a quiet reset. McCarthy is clearly not trying to tweak what existed before. He is reshaping it to fit his worldview, and that includes accepting friction if necessary. That friction shows up most clearly at wide receiver. Roman Wilson is not just a player in this story, he is a symbol of where development, patience, and urgency collide. If he stays, he represents belief in internal growth. If he goes, he represents a pivot towards certainty and trust-based football, especially if Rodgers is involved. Either outcome tells you something